Richard Thompson stood proudly at the entrance of his high-end restaurant. The Ivy Room, a symbol of sophistication nestled in the heart of an elite neighborhood. To the outside world, Richard was the epitome of success, a self-made man who had turned a humble diner into a prestigious eatery frequented by the city's elite. But behind the gleaming facade of polished silverware and perfectly folded napkins lay a darker truth about Richard's success. You see, Richard had a very particular idea of what his clientele should look like, and this notion was rooted not in business acumen, but in deep-seated prejudice. The Ivy Room wasn't just a restaurant, it was a fortress of exclusivity. Richard maintained an unspoken policy, carefully cultivating a clientele he deemed appropriate. This wasn't spelled out in any handbook, of course. Richard was too shrewd for that. Instead, his bias operated in the shadows, hidden behind a facade of civility. While he didn't hang a sign on the door explicitly barring anyone, his subtle actions made it abundantly clear to those who didn't fit in that they weren't welcome. He prided himself on this gatekeeping, convinced that his restaurant's exclusivity was the secret to its success. But the truth was, Richard's vision of exclusivity was rooted in fear. Fear of change, fear of diversity, fear of the unknown, and, above all, fear of losing control. For years, he operated unchallenged, oblivious to the quiet resentment brewing among those he excluded. He never imagined that his carefully constructed world could be turned upside down in a single evening. But, as you'll see, fate has a funny way of humbling even the most self-assured among us. Today, we're diving into an incredible story, one that begins with prejudice and exclusion, but ends with an extraordinary twist. It's a tale of two worlds colliding and the lessons that come from such a collision. So, if stories of resilience and poetic justice stir something deep within you, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. By the end of this video, you'll not only be inspired, but also left with a profound reflection on the power of inclusion and integrity. Let's unravel this story together. It was a crisp autumn evening when James and Emily Davis arrived at the Ivy Room. They weren't just any couple. They were celebrating their 10th wedding anniversary, a milestone they had planned meticulously to mark with elegance. James, a tall man with an air of quiet dignity, was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that matched his wife's shimmering silver gown. Emily, whose graceful demeanor commanded attention without effort, wore a warm smile that could light up any room. Together, they radiated sophistication, their presence a testament to the life they had built together through perseverance and love. The couple had heard much about the Ivy Room and its impeccable reputation. Though they knew the restaurant was perched in one of the city's wealthiest districts, they had no reason to doubt their place at the table. After all, their reservation had been confirmed. Their attire was impeccable, and their excitement for the evening was palpable. Little did they know, however, that their very presence would challenge the unspoken rules of this so-called haven of exclusivity. As they stepped through the grand double doors, the soft murmur of conversation briefly faltered. Heads turned, not out of admiration for their elegance, but out of surprise. Surprise that a black couple had ventured into this sanctified space. Richard Thompson, stationed at his usual post near the entrance, noticed them immediately. His practiced smile faltered for a split second, an imperceptible flicker to most, but a telling sign for anyone attuned to such nuances. Internally, Richard was already scrutinizing them, questioning their reservation and, more insidiously, their right to be there. James approached the host stand with confidence, offering his name for the reservation. Richard's initial instinct was to question it, but his professional veneer held firm. With a tight smile and a flick of his hand, he motioned them toward their table. "Right this way," he said, his voice honeyed with false politeness. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, his mind raced with justifications for what he was about to do. The table he led them to was tucked away near the kitchen, a spot notorious for being the least desirable in the entire restaurant. The clatter of dishes and the shouts of chefs made it impossible to ignore the proximity to the bustling kitchen staff. It was the kind of table reserved for last-minute walk-ins, not a couple with a week's in-advance reservation. Richard's choice was deliberate, a subtle way to communicate that in his eyes, they did not belong. Emily exchanged a glance with James as they sat down. Her expression betrayed a mix of confusion and disappointment. They had specifically requested a quiet, intimate corner when they made their reservation, and this table was anything but. Still, they decided to remain calm, determined not to let the unexpected seating arrangement dampen their special evening. But as the minutes ticked by, more signs of prejudice began to emerge. The couple sat unnoticed while waitstaff darted around them, attending to other tables with swift efficiency. When their server finally approached, the greeting was curt, the tone bordering on dismissive. Their drink orders were taken, but their water glasses remained empty. When the breadbasket arrived, significantly later than it should have, it was missing the restaurant's signature warm butter. Despite these indignities, James and Emily maintained their composure. They spoke in hushed tones, laughing softly as they reminisced about the early days of their relationship. They refused to let the cold treatment from the staff ruin their evening. And yet, the atmosphere around them was impossible to ignore. Other diners stole glances in their direction, some with mild curiosity, others with barely concealed disdain. Whispers rippled through the room like a faint breeze, carrying with them the unmistakable weight of judgment. Richard, watching from the sidelines, felt a perverse sense of satisfaction. He believed he had handled the situation perfectly subtle enough to avoid outright confrontation, yet clear enough to make his point. In his mind, he had upheld the sanctity of his establishment. What he didn't realize was that this couple was far more than they appeared. And the evening, far from being an inconvenience for James and Emily, was the beginning of a lesson Richard would never forget. As the dinner service continued, the tension at their table was palpable but contained. The couple's dignified restraint spoke volumes, a quiet resistance to the blatant discrimination they were facing. It was clear that they weren't going to cause a scene or give anyone the satisfaction of seeing them leave prematurely. Instead, they would endure the evening with grace, knowing that dignity is a more powerful weapon than outrage in such moments. The true weight of their presence wasn't in what they said or did that night. It was in who they were. James and Emily Davis weren't just any couple out for a celebratory dinner. They were individuals whose influence and success far exceeded the narrow perceptions of a man like Richard. Their calm demeanor was not a sign of submission, but a quiet confidence born from years of breaking barriers and defying expectations. And by the end of the night, that confidence would become Richard's undoing. As James and Emily prepared to leave, the evening had taken on a significance far greater than a simple anniversary dinner. They exchanged a knowing glance as they rose from their seats, understanding that the events of the evening would not end here. They had no intention of forgetting Richard's actions, nor would they let them go unanswered. The seeds of change had been planted, and the harvest would come soon enough. What James and Emily did next would not only shake Richard to his core, but also transform the Ivy Room forever. Stay with us as we dive into how a simple dinner turned into a turning point that Richard never saw coming, and the extraordinary way this couple decided to respond to injustice with power and poise. You won't want to miss this. As the evening wore on, the cracks in the facade of the Ivy Room became increasingly visible. James and Emily, seated at the noisy table by the kitchen, had initially brushed off the slight as a logistical oversight. But as the minutes turned to hours, the patterns of disregard and subtle hostility became undeniable. The service, which was ordinarily the pride of the restaurant, lagged significantly. Orders that should have been delivered promptly were either delayed or outright forgotten. Their waiter, who seemed attentive at every other table, was conspicuously indifferent to their needs. When their appetizers finally arrived, the plates were slightly cold, a stark contrast to the steaming, artfully presented dishes seen at other tables. The presentation, usually impeccable at the Ivy Room, seemed rushed, as if the kitchen had not cared enough to make the effort. James noticed how other tables, even those who had arrived later, were receiving their entrees before they had even been offered a second drink. It was clear they were being treated differently, not through overt acts of hostility, but through a series of small, calculated indignities. The food, the service, and even the atmosphere around their table seemed deliberately engineered to communicate one thing: that they were not welcome. The other patrons' reactions added an extra layer of discomfort. Couples exchanged knowing glances, and whispers passed from one table to another. Some diners masked their curiosity behind polite disinterest, while others openly stared. It wasn't just the staff who saw James and Emily as outsiders. It was the entire room. Emily, ever composed, refused to let the judgmental gazes and delayed service disrupt their evening. She leaned forward, speaking softly to James about their favorite anniversary memories, determined to focus on the joy of the occasion rather than the tension surrounding them. But Richard Thompson wasn't done making his point. He approached their table with the confidence of someone who believed he had the moral high ground. He wore a carefully curated expression, friendly on the surface, but underscored with condescension. Standing tall, he addressed the couple in a tone that could easily be mistaken for polite conversation, though his words carried a pointed message. "Good evening," Richard began, clasping his hands behind his back. "I trust you're enjoying your meal?" Emily looked up, her smile polite but guarded. "It's lovely, thank you," she replied, her tone gracious despite the obvious subtext in Richard's demeanor. "That's wonderful to hear," he said, pausing as if to choose his words carefully. "You know, we don't often see new faces here. Our regular clientele tends to favor a certain ambience." James raised an eyebrow, catching the unspoken implication immediately. Richard's attempt at subtlety wasn't fooling anyone. He wasn't welcoming them. He was testing them, trying to gauge their reaction to his thinly veiled message. Emily, ever poised, responded with a measured smile. "Well, we heard such wonderful things about the Ivy Room. Its reputation precedes it, and we thought it would be the perfect place to celebrate our anniversary." Her words were deliberate, a quiet assertion of their right to be there. Richard hesitated, thrown off by her calm response. He had expected them to shrink under the weight of his disapproval, to apologize for intruding into his domain. Instead, Emily's composure and James's steady gaze left him momentarily at a loss. "Of course," Richard said finally, his smile tightening. "Well, enjoy the rest of your evening." As he walked away, James and Emily exchanged a glance, silently acknowledging the tension of the interaction. They knew they were being tested, and they also knew that their very presence was a statement, a challenge to the unspoken rules Richard had built his empire upon. But Richard's attempts to rattle them didn't stop there. As the evening progressed, their entrees were delayed by an inexplicable amount of time. When the dishes finally arrived, they were lukewarm and the flavors seemed off. A far cry from the exquisite meals the restaurant was known for. The waiter, when they tried to bring up the issue, dismissed their concerns with a cursory, "I'll let the kitchen know," never returning with a resolution. Despite these indignities, James and Emily remained calm. They had faced far greater challenges in their lives than an unwelcoming restaurant owner and his complicit staff. What mattered to them wasn't the food or the service, it was the principle. They weren't just a couple out for dinner. They were a living testament to resilience and grace. And though Richard didn't know it yet, they were far more influential than he could have imagined. As the evening drew to a close, James and Emily chose not to engage further with the staff's indifference or Richard's thinly veiled hostility. They finished their meal in quiet dignity, paid their bill, and rose to leave. But before they stepped out the door, James paused, turning to look at Richard, who was stationed near the entrance once again. "Thank you for the experience," James said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of meaning that Richard couldn't quite place. "It's been enlightening." With that, the couple exited, leaving Richard puzzled and slightly unsettled. He had expected anger, perhaps even a confrontation. Instead, their calm departure left him with an uneasy feeling he couldn't shake. What happens when the people you underestimate turn out to hold all the cards? Richard had no idea that James and Emily were about to turn his world upside down. Stay tuned to discover the shocking twist that would force Richard to confront the consequences of his prejudice and redefine the future of the Ivy Room. This story is just getting started. Don't miss what comes next. The following days at the Ivy Room unfolded as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Richard Thompson went about his routine with the same self-satisfaction that had carried him through years of managing his exclusive establishment. He had all but dismissed the couple who had unsettled his evening, relegating their presence to a footnote in the daily grind of maintaining his empire. Little did he know, the events of that night had set in motion a chain reaction that would soon dismantle the very foundations of his business. It began with an envelope, arriving one crisp morning with the rest of the mail. It bore the letterhead of a prestigious law firm. Richard, assuming it to be a routine legal matter, opened it without much thought. His eyes scanned the neatly typed lines, but as their meaning sank in, his expression shifted from mild curiosity to visible alarm. The letter wasn't a legal dispute or an inquiry. It was a proposal. A prominent investment group, represented by the firm, expressed interest in purchasing the Ivy Room. The offer was generous, astonishingly so. It far exceeded the market value of the restaurant, promising Richard a payout that could secure his financial future for decades. At first glance, it seemed too good to be true, but Richard's confidence turned to suspicion as he read further. The terms of the proposal were unusually specific. Not only did they require the immediate transfer of ownership, but they also demanded that Richard sever all ties to the business entirely. He was to step away from the restaurant industry for good, leaving no room for negotiation or compromise. The abruptness of the conditions left him uneasy, but the offer was so lucrative that he couldn't dismiss it outright. Who were these buyers? Why were they so intent on acquiring his restaurant? Richard's mind raced with possibilities, none of which prepared him for the truth that was about to unfold. That evening, as the restaurant buzzed with its usual activity, Richard received another unexpected visit. This time, it wasn't a courier or an envelope. It was James and Emily Davis. They entered with the same quiet dignity that had marked their anniversary dinner, but this time, there was a palpable shift in their presence. They weren't just patrons tonight. They were something more. Richard approached them, his practiced smile masking his confusion. "Good evening," he began, trying to gauge their intentions. "I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon." Emily returned his greeting with a polite nod, while James spoke with calm authority. "We thought it would be a good time to discuss the proposal you received this morning." Richard blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "The proposal?" he repeated, though the realization was dawning on him. "You're involved with the group making the offer?" James didn't hesitate. "We are the group making the offer." The weight of those words hit Richard like a freight train. His initial shock quickly gave way to disbelief. He glanced between James and Emily, struggling to reconcile the elegant couple standing before him with the powerful investors who had issued the proposal. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice faltering slightly. Emily stepped in, her tone measured but firm. "We are, and we believe it's in everyone's best interest to accept." For a moment, Richard was at a loss for words. His mind raced with questions, but one in particular stood out. Why would they want his restaurant? And why would they want him out? The answers, as James and Emily soon revealed, were both simple and profound. "We've spent years building a network of businesses that prioritize inclusion, excellence, and integrity," James explained. "When we came to your restaurant, we weren't just celebrating an anniversary. We were evaluating the space, the service, and the ethos behind it." Emily continued, her voice unwavering. "What we experienced that night was disappointing, but it also confirmed something important. This restaurant has potential. Under the right leadership, it could be a beacon of what hospitality should truly represent." Richard bristled, his pride flaring. "I've built this place from the ground up," he retorted. "It's my vision, my success." "And that's precisely why we're here," James replied, his tone sharp but controlled. "Your vision is limited, Richard. It excludes people who don't fit into your narrow idea of success. That's not just bad business, it's bad humanity." The words stung, though Richard refused to show it. Instead, he clung to the one shred of leverage he believed he still had, his control over the sale. "You can't force me to sell," he said, crossing his arms defiantly. Emily met his defiance with a calm that unnerved him. "You're right," she said. "We can't force you. But the offer we've made is more than fair." Refusing it would raise questions, especially when those questions come from investors who value transparency. Richard's chest tightened. He knew what she was implying. The city's elite circles were small, and reputations could crumble with a single misstep. Refusing such a generous offer without a sound reason would invite scrutiny, potentially exposing his biases to the very clientele he worked so hard to impress. Silence hung between them as Richard weighed his options. He could cling to his pride and risk everything, or he could walk away with a fortune, albeit with his ego bruised. The choice, though clear, felt like a bitter pill to swallow. But this confrontation was only the beginning. As Richard grappled with his decision, James and Emily had already begun to lay the groundwork for a transformation that would redefine the Ivy Room and its legacy. What happened next would not only change the restaurant, but also challenge the very foundations of Richard's beliefs. Stay with us to see how this extraordinary couple turned a moment of exclusion into a story of empowerment and triumph. Richard Thompson finally made his decision. Begrudgingly, and with a heavy heart, he signed the papers that transferred ownership of the Ivy Room to James and Emily Davis. The payout was staggering, more than he could have ever imagined for his restaurant. But the victory felt hollow. For Richard, it wasn't just the loss of his business. It was the realization that his grip on the world he had curated so carefully was slipping away. James and Emily wasted no time implementing their vision. With their backgrounds in the hospitality industry, they were seasoned investors who had successfully revitalized multiple establishments. They understood that change had to start from the ground up. The first step was dismantling the culture of exclusivity that had defined the Ivy Room for so long. The announcement of new ownership sent ripples through the community. The news was met with curiosity, skepticism, and, in some corners, outright resistance. Longtime patrons wondered what this change meant for their cherished dining spot. Meanwhile, others, who had never dared to step foot inside, felt a glimmer of hope that the restaurant might finally open its doors to a broader audience. Emily spearheaded the redesign of the restaurant, working with a team of interior designers to transform the space into one that radiated warmth and inclusivity. Gone were the cold, minimalist tones and the stark separation of spaces meant to isolate diners. Instead, the new design featured rich, inviting colors, communal seating areas, and artwork celebrating diversity and culture. The atmosphere shifted from one of exclusivity to one of belonging. James, meanwhile, focused on retraining the staff. He held workshops on cultural sensitivity, customer service, and the importance of fostering a welcoming environment. Some employees resisted the changes, unwilling to adapt to the new vision. James and Emily were firm but fair, offering those who couldn't align with the new values an opportunity to leave gracefully. In their place, they hired a diverse team of professionals who shared their commitment to excellence and inclusivity. The menu, once rigid and catered to a narrow palate, also underwent a transformation. James and Emily brought in a new executive chef, known for their innovative approach to blending global flavors. The updated offerings celebrated culinary traditions from around the world, making the Ivy Room not just a restaurant, but a celebration of culture through food. Word of the changes spread quickly. Social media buzzed with posts about the revamped Ivy Room, with glowing reviews pouring in from diners who had felt unwelcome in the restaurant's previous incarnation. Local news outlets picked up the story, highlighting James and Emily's efforts to create a space that prioritized community over exclusivity. Within months, the restaurant saw a surge in popularity, drawing a more diverse clientele than it ever had under Richard's ownership. But the transformation wasn't just about aesthetics or menu changes. It was about the people who walked through the doors. Families celebrated birthdays, friends gathered for brunch, and couples shared romantic dinners, all without fear of judgment or exclusion. The Ivy Room had become a symbol of what hospitality could and should be, a place where everyone felt valued and respected. As the restaurant flourished, James and Emily remained humble, often mingling with guests and sharing their story. They spoke openly about the challenges they had faced, both personally and professionally, and how those experiences had shaped their vision for the Ivy Room. Their authenticity resonated with people, making the restaurant not just a place to eat, but a beacon of hope and resilience. Meanwhile, Richard Thompson watched from the sidelines. With the payout from the sale, he had the means to retire comfortably, but he found little solace in his newfound wealth. The life he had built, based on exclusion and prejudice, felt increasingly hollow as he witnessed the success of James and Emily's vision. The realization was bitter but undeniable. The principles he had once dismissed as impractical diversity, inclusion, integrity were, in fact, the foundation of true success. As the Ivy Room flourished under James and Emily's leadership, Richard couldn't ignore the growing unease in his heart. His reflections on what he had lost and why would lead to an unexpected journey of self-discovery. Could a man set in his ways change his perspective, or was it too late to undo the damage caused by years of prejudice? Stick around as we explore the aftermath of Richard's choices and the surprising turn his story takes. Richard Thompson's days had grown quiet. No longer the master of his domain, he spent his time in the solitude of his sprawling suburban home, surrounded by the artifacts of a life built on exclusion. Yet, even amidst his comforts, peace eluded him. The world had moved on, and the restaurant that once symbolized his success was now thriving under new ownership, a reality that gnawed at him more with each passing day. He had avoided visiting the Ivy Room since the sale, unwilling to see the changes that James and Emily had implemented. But the whispers of its success reached him nonetheless. Friends who still dined there spoke of the vibrant atmosphere, the diverse clientele, and the exquisite food. Even local media outlets hailed it as a shining example of what inclusivity in hospitality could achieve. Richard read these accounts with a mixture of disbelief and resentment, but he couldn't deny the truth. They had done what he never could. One evening, unable to suppress his curiosity any longer, Richard decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. He told himself it wasn't about the restaurant, but his feet carried him there anyway. When he arrived, he paused across the street, his gaze fixed on the glowing sign of the Ivy Room. The warm light spilling from its windows revealed a scene that was both familiar and foreign. The restaurant was bustling, its patrons a colorful tapestry of backgrounds and cultures. Laughter and conversation spilled out into the night air, a stark contrast to the hushed exclusivity Richard had once enforced. He lingered there, unnoticed, observing the life his former establishment now radiated. For the first time, Richard saw the restaurant, not as a reflection of his own ideals, but as a symbol of something greater, something he had never fully understood. The sight unsettled him, stirring memories he had long buried. Richard's prejudice hadn't always been so overt. It had crept into his life over years, shaped by subtle influences and reinforced by the echo chamber of privilege he had inhabited. He had justified his biases as standards, convinced himself that his version of exclusivity was synonymous with excellence. But now, standing on the outside looking in, he was forced to confront the consequences of those beliefs. The next morning, Richard sat in his study, surrounded by relics of his past. Framed awards from the restaurant's early days, photos with influential figures, and glowing reviews adorned the walls. Yet, none of these tokens brought him pride anymore. Instead, They felt like artifacts of a bygone era, one that he had built but could no longer celebrate. Richard decided to do something he hadn't done in years: reach out to an old friend. He called Henry, a retired restaurateur who had once been a mentor to him. Over coffee, Richard shared the story of what had happened with the Ivy Room, omitting no detail. To his surprise, Henry listened without judgment, his expression thoughtful. "Richard," Henry said finally, setting down his cup, "it sounds like you've been given a rare opportunity. Not many people get the chance to see the impact of their choices so clearly." Richard frowned. "An opportunity? Henry, I lost everything I built. They took my restaurant and turned it into something I don't even recognize." Henry shook his head gently. "No, Richard, you gave it away the moment you decided that exclusivity was more important than connection. But it's not too late to learn from this. You can't undo the past, but you can change what you do next." Those words stayed with Richard long after their conversation ended. For the first time, he began to see his downfall not as a punishment, but as a wake-up call. He realized that his pride and prejudice had blinded him to the potential of inclusivity, not just as a business strategy, but as a way of life. The success of the Ivy Room under James and Emily's leadership wasn't a fluke. It was the result of principles he had dismissed as impractical. Richard's journey of reflection didn't end there. He started reading about the experiences of marginalized communities, attending workshops on diversity and inclusion, and seeking out conversations that challenged his worldview. It wasn't easy. Decades of ingrained bias don't dissolve overnight, but he was determined to understand what he had missed. One day, after much contemplation, Richard reached out to James and Emily. His message was simple. He wanted to meet, not as adversaries, but as equals. To his surprise, they agreed. The meeting was scheduled for a quiet afternoon, away from the bustle of the restaurant. When they sat down together, Richard spoke with a humility that would have been unthinkable months earlier. "I wanted to apologize," he began, his voice steady but earnest. "Not just for how I treated you that night, but for everything that treatment represented. I see now how wrong I was, and I want to thank you for showing me what this restaurant and life could be." James and Emily exchanged a glance, their expressions softening. Emily was the first to respond. "Acknowledging the harm you've caused is a start, Richard. Change takes time, but it's never too late to begin." The conversation that followed was honest and at times uncomfortable. Richard shared his journey of self-reflection, while James and Emily spoke candidly about the challenges they had faced and the importance of using privilege to uplift others. By the end of the meeting, they weren't friends, exactly, but there was a mutual understanding, a sense that even the deepest divides could be bridged with effort and sincerity. Richard's journey wasn't over, and neither was the story of the Ivy Room. What happened next would test whether his newfound understanding could lead to real change, not just in his life, but in the legacy he hoped to leave behind. Could Richard find redemption, or would his past continue to define him? Stay with us as we uncover the powerful conclusion to this remarkable tale. Richard Thompson's journey from self-assured restaurateur to humbled observer of his own undoing had been marked by revelations he never anticipated. Confronting his prejudices and their consequences had been painful, but it had also opened the door to something unexpected, a chance at redemption. He no longer saw his life as a monument to exclusivity, but as an opportunity to right his wrongs. Yet, redemption is never easy, and Richard's next steps would define the legacy he left behind. The day after his meeting with James and Emily, Richard made a decision that had been brewing in his mind since he first observed the vibrant new life at the Ivy Room. If his fall from grace had taught him anything, it was that the walls of exclusion he built had not only kept others out, but had also imprisoned him within. It was time to break those walls down. Richard began by reaching out to organizations he had once ignored. He partnered with local diversity and inclusion groups to educate himself further and to offer support. He started attending community meetings, something he had avoided for years. and he really listened to stories of those who had been marginalized, including by places like his former restaurant. One organization, the City Hospitality Collective, caught his attention. They worked to train underrepresented individuals in the culinary arts, offering scholarships, mentorship, and placement opportunities. Richard offered to fund a new initiative in their program, the Thompson Fellowship for Inclusive Hospitality. The name felt like a small but necessary penance for the harm he had caused. The fellowship provided resources for aspiring chefs and restaurant managers from diverse backgrounds, helping them break into an industry that had historically excluded them. This initiative wasn't just a symbolic gesture. Richard immersed himself in the program, mentoring students and sharing his hard-earned lessons. He spoke openly about his mistakes, using his story as a cautionary tale. At first, his presence was met with skepticism, but over time, his sincerity and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths earned him respect, even from those who had every reason to resent him. As the months turned into years, Richard's life took on a new rhythm. Though he would never reclaim the prestige he once enjoyed, he found something far more fulfilling: purpose. He continued to stay involved with the Ivy Room, not as an owner, but as a quiet supporter of its mission. James and Emily, recognizing his genuine efforts to change, invited him to attend some of the restaurant's community events. These gatherings were a testament to how far the establishment had come, a place where people from all walks of life came together to celebrate food, culture, and connection. One particularly memorable evening came on the 5th anniversary of James and Emily's ownership. The Ivy Room hosted a gala to raise funds for local charities supporting underprivileged communities. The guest list was as diverse as the city itself, a vivid tapestry of backgrounds and experiences. Richard attended, not as a guest of honor, but as one of many who believed in the power of inclusion. During the event, James stood to give a speech, thanking the community for their support and reflecting on the journey that had brought the restaurant to where it was. Toward the end of his remarks, he paused, scanning the room until his eyes settled on Richard. "There's someone here tonight who reminds us that change is always possible," James said, his voice steady. "We all have the capacity to reflect, to grow, and to make amends. And when we do, we create a better world, not just for ourselves, but for everyone." The room erupted into applause, and Richard, seated near the back, felt a wave of emotion he hadn't expected. It wasn't pride. He had long since shed that particular armor. It was gratitude. Gratitude for the opportunity to transform his mistakes into something meaningful, and for the people who had shown him what true leadership looked like. In the years that followed, Richard became a quiet but influential advocate for change in the hospitality industry. He wrote a memoir, Breaking the Barrier: Lessons from a Life Rebuilt, which chronicled his journey from exclusion to inclusion. The book became a bestseller, not because of his fame, but because of its raw honesty and the universal truths it explored. Richard lived to see the Ivy Room become more than a restaurant. Under James and Emily's guidance, it evolved into a cultural landmark, a space where art, food, and community converged. It became a model for other establishments, proving that inclusivity wasn't just good ethics, it was good business. Richard Thompson's story is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to change. His journey from a man consumed by prejudice to an advocate for inclusion shows us that redemption is possible, but it requires humility, effort, and an unwavering commitment to growth. As for James and Emily, their triumph wasn't just in turning the Ivy Room into a thriving establishment, but in using it as a platform to redefine what success looks like in the hospitality industry. They proved that excellence and inclusivity are not mutually exclusive, but are, in fact, inseparable. So, what about you? What legacy do you want to leave behind? Stories like this remind us that every choice we make shapes the world around us. If this story touched your heart or inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. And remember, real change starts with us. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.